What are you all studying? What year are you right now? Freshman. So you're studying basic Catholicism? And y'all? Seniors. So you're just studying how to sleep in class without getting caught? Yes. I taught high school for a while too. What's that? Juniors. Juniors are studying moral theology, correct? Good. Oh, that's good stuff. I began last time with trying to give a little bit of background because of what we're dealing with in the news, a little bit of background on Islam. And it's impossible to understand without knowing something of Muhammad himself. Muhammad was born in Mecca around 585 AD, and his father died when his mother was pregnant. His mother died when he was 6. His grandfather adopted him, and his grandfather died when he was 8. So he was left in the care of one of his uncles. And by the time he was 11 or 12, he was already working full-time, probably before that, but we know that by the time he was 12, he went on with the caravans to Damascus, because that was a major trade route between the Farther Orient to Mecca, and then Mecca up to Damascus. Mecca was a pagan city. It had lots of idols. As a matter of fact, it was a pagan shrine, and in that shrine is a place called the Kaaba. The Kaaba is a small stone building that contained about 360 different idols within it at the time of Muhammad. And tribes from all over Arabia would come to Mecca for trade and to worship at the shrine. When he was 25, working for a woman named Khadija, and he was very, very famous for being extremely honest in his business. She was impressed, and she, though 40 years old, married this 25-year-old. And they had 5 children together. Only 2 became adults, both daughters, and only one of those daughters survived Muhammad, and that is the famous Fatima. So Fatima survived her father, the only one of his children. He eventually had 16 wives because he would marry a lot of slaves and captives. And none of the children from any of his wives survived at childhood. Only Fatima and one daughter from Khadija. Khadija was a Christian, and she had a relative, a cousin of some sort, named Warqa ibn Nawfal. Warqa ibn Nawfal was a monk who was the first to translate the Bible into Arabic. So Muhammad heard Bible stories from this relative, but Muhammad never learned to read or write. He couldn't read or write at all. And he, as oftentimes happens, when you only hear a story and don't go into studying what's going on, you sometimes get things confused, as he did, for instance, when he describes the Blessed Virgin Mary. The Blessed Virgin Mary is the only woman mentioned by name in the whole Quran. All the women are mentioned as the wife of Adam, never called Eve, the wife of Noah, the wife of Moses, the wife of David, and so on. But they never are mentioned. Not even Muhammad's own mother is mentioned by name. Only the Virgin Mary. But she is called Miriam bint Imran. And this is a problem because Imran was a character in the Old Testament. His daughter was named Maryam, or Mary. But that Mary's 2 brothers are also mentioned. Imran was the father of Miriam and her brother Moses and Aaron. So he's got the wrong guy. The gap between Imran and the Blessed Virgin Mary is a 1,300-year gap. So he's got the wrong character entirely. And a lot of other mistakes like that he makes. Also, there are points where he rejects things from Christianity when talking about Jesus. Matter of fact, he does not even have the name for Jesus correct. I wish I had a board I could show you more easily. But he calls, the name that's given in the Quran is usually Isa. Isa. That's not the word for Jesus in Arabic. In Arabic, Jesus is Yeshua. Yeshua. And the name that Muhammad gives him in the Quran has exactly the same letters for Jesus, Yeshua, only backwards. They're in reverse. And they mean something completely different. So there are a number of such errors that he made in the Quran. And this, I almost forgot to mention, in the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157, it says that they thought they had crucified Isa, but they had not. In other words, he rejects the crucifixion of Jesus. Why? Because Islam does not believe in the redemption. That is, they don't believe in original sin, and Islam does not believe in the redemption. You don't need Christ to die for sin. Nobody can die for sin. And besides, more importantly, in Muslim theology, a prophet cannot be killed. And so they believed that there's another guy that looked like Jesus who was crucified, and they thought it was Jesus, but it wasn't. I remember one time I was in Jerusalem, and there was a guy selling T-shirts on the street. He was from Hamas, the religious branch of Hamas, not the political violent one. And he was selling the T-shirts. So I bought a couple for my niece and nephew. And he says to me, Abuna, which is Arabic for father, Abuna, I'm very much sorry, but Jesus, he is not the Son of God. He did not die on the cross. Now, to deal with Trinitarian theology is not a good starting point. So I asked him a question. Who knows you better than anybody in the world? And he didn't answer. So I said, it's your mother. Nobody knows you the way your mother knows you. She bore you, she fed you, nursed you, clothed you, cared for you, everything. And my problem is this, that the Lady Mary says that she saw Jesus die on the cross. So he says, but Abuna, maybe he is all covered up. She thinks this Jesus is another man, which in Muslim theology they call the shabih, the look-alike. And I said, no, this is the problem. They took away all the clothes she had made for him. Because again, everybody in the Middle East knows they didn't have Walmart 2,000 years ago. Your mother made you your clothes. And so I said, my problem is this. Do I believe the Lady Mary, who says she saw Jesus die, or Muhammad, who 600 years later says he did not? Now, I didn't call Muhammad any names. You never do that. You never insult the Prophet Muhammad. That's just not necessary, and it's not right. But I could point out that this is a problem, that he disagrees with Lady Mary. And in the Quran, Muhammad gets forgiven of his sins. There's a verse that says, your sins have been forgiven. But neither the Lady Mary nor Jesus ever sin, that they are pure and without sin, according to Muslim theology. So she could not lie. It's impossible for her in Muslim theology as well as Christian. And there's no reason for her to lie. And so I said, this is my problem, and I made it his problem too. But the thing that's very important to understand about Islam, because our politicians and various people in the media will like to talk about how Islam is a religion of peace, because there are verses in Surah 2, verse Surah 4, and other places that say there's no contention about religion. And they call for peace, okay? And there's a very famous phrase, Islam wa Tislam. If you submit to God, you will have peace. In other words, if you convert to Islam, then you'll have peace. So they cite all that. Here's the problem, is they ignore the other verses and they don't understand the difference of them. Because when Muhammad began to prophesy between 610 and July of 622, he lived in Mecca. I already mentioned that he was a very vulnerable person. His father was dead, he was very poor until he married Khadija, and then she was wealthy. But when she died, he became vulnerable again. And in that whole period of the first 12 years, he prophesied, there's only one God. God is the creator of everything. He is the judge of everyone. You must believe in the one God and act in a way that is righteous, especially caring for the poor. One of the 5 pillars of Islam is to give alms to the poor. Though for them, it is giving alms to poor Muslims, not to non-Muslims. But giving alms to the poor is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. And he said you have to pray. That's another pillar of Islam. And he was fast during Ramadan, another pillar of Islam. So he taught, that was his teaching. But in July of 622, he had to flee Mecca because the other members of his tribe, the Qurayshi, were persecuting him because they didn't want to hear it. They were materially very well off, and they did not want anybody criticizing their behavior. So they were plotting to kill him and his cousin Ali. And so he got all of his disciples to, family by family, slowly leave Mecca and go to a nearby town, Yathrib. It's now called Medina. And then finally in July, he escaped. That is known as the Hijrah and the immigration. And that is the point from which they mark history. Just as we begin with Christ's birth, they begin history. The demarcation line is the Hijrah, before the Hijrah or after the Hijrah. By autumn of 622, Muhammad began to tell his disciples that since the people of Mecca had persecuted us, we can attack their caravans even in the sacred month of nonviolence, because we are starving and they were mean to us. This is a turning point in Islamic theology, because from that point on, you see the verses increase for the next 10 years of living in Medina, of telling people, jihadu el-kufar, have the struggle, struggle against the infidels. And then that's rare. Much more commonly, the Quran says, qatalu el-kufar, qataluhum, which means in Arabic, strive against them or fight against them, but it's not the normal word for fight. It is a word, the root is qatl, meaning to kill. And in that form, qatalu means try to kill. When you see the word strive in the Quran, it's normally the word try to kill the infidels. And that is repeated over and over, most strongly in chapters 8 and 9. The chapter is actually called a surah. In chapters 8 and 9, but it's scattered throughout all the Medina verses. And in the Quran, there are less than 30 occasions in which God describes what he loves. God's love is rarely directed towards humans, but more towards actions humans might do. And in Surah 61, verse 4, it reads, "Inna Allahu yuhibbu alladhina yaqtalu fi sabilihi." God loves those who try to kill in his path. These verses are used by groups like ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood and the Wahhabi sect and Boko Haram and Islamic Jihad and one group, Hamas, all these various groups around the world that are causing this chaos throughout the Muslim world, and they can justify it with those verses. Now, the question is this. We haven't seen this kind of Islamic violence arise in a long time. What is going on? It's a reaction. In 1917 and 18, the Turkish Empire was falling apart in the World War. They lined themselves with the Axis in the First World War, and like the rest of the Axis, they lost. And the Ottoman Empire collapsed. But what survived of it was led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was a radical nationalist. He and the military leaders of Turkey wanted a nationalistic government in which Turkey is only for the Turks. So they killed 1.5 million Armenians. And then after the war, they drove out a few million, I think it's 4 or 5 million Greeks who lived throughout the region. And he said, now we've got rid of all these foreigners and we will have a pure Turkish government. They ruined their economy because they were ignorant. They had no comprehension. The Greeks and the Armenians knew how business worked. They ran any of the corporations and such, and they kept the economy going. The Turks had no clue, and they went way down immediately. While they're doing that, the same nationalistic ideas were picked up in Syria. And from those ideas came a word you probably hear in the news called the Ba'ath Party. Ever hear that word? Ba'ath Party? It means the Renaissance or rebirth. This was a movement of Arabic nationalism that Arabs across from Morocco to Iraq would all unite together as an Arab nation, regardless of religion, whether you're Christian, Muslim, or Jew, doesn't matter. If you're an Arab, then we will form a national movement and an empire of Arabs in which we'll all unite. Well, they could not get along, and the Ba'ath Party split up into various segments. One in Iraq, one in Syria. And the Ba'ath Party was the one headed by Saddam Hussein, who began as a hitman for the Ba'ath Party. And after he'd done enough hits against his various political enemies, he realized, I can keep going. And he did hits against the Ba'ath leaders and got himself to be the president of Iraq. Al-Assad, not the present one, but his father in Syria, Hafiz al-Assad, was also Ba'ath, but he hated the Iraqi Ba'ath. He got a nationalist movement with his military in the mid-60s. And they still rule Syria, though now we see this terrible civil war. Not the first one in Syria. Another nationalist movement was started by a colonel in Egypt called Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser started this Nasserite party that took over Egypt with a nationalist purpose. And until President Mubarak was overthrown, they ruled. Gaddafi in Libya was another colonel who used nationalistic ideas to take over Libya. And of course, the Shah of Iran was a nationalist. So all these different countries, except for the Arabian Peninsula, where you have the King of Arabia and the various emirs in the Gulf states, and Jordan has a king also. The rest of them had these nationalistic governments. And they became extraordinarily oppressive. They were as oppressive as the nationalist governments of Europe from whom they learned to be nationalist. In fact, the Ba'ath Party of Iraq at one point had their flag as a 3-point swastika. They didn't want the 4-point because that was too much like a cross. When the British pushed hard on them, the leader of the Ba'ath Party, al-Husseini, not related to Saddam Hussein, another guy, he went to Berlin and spent the rest of the war in Berlin organizing Muslims in Bosnia as a Muslim Nazi unit to go exterminate Jews. And so this nationalistic movement became as oppressive in each of the countries as nationalists had been in Europe. And as the various nationalistic governments got overthrown, whether it be the United States taking out Hussein, or the chaos we see in Syria, or the Muslim Brotherhood overthrowing Mubarak in Egypt, or the mobs attacking Gaddafi, as each one of these went under, and also the Shah of Iran being the first one to go under Islamists, the reaction was a radical Islamic government must replace these demonic ideas of nationalism that came from Europe. And we will have pure Islam. What resulted was a competition of hatred over who should lead Islam. I should be the Khalifa, the Caliph, because I hate the Jews. No, I should be Khalifa. I hate the Jews and the Christians. No, I hate the Jews, the Christians, and the Shia, or the Sunni, depending on what side you are. This competition of increased hatred, using those verses of violence throughout the Quran to justify it, have led to this chaos in which way more Muslims get killed by Muslim radicals than they kill Westerners or Christians. But they do kill Christians. I mean, the viciousness of ISIS is unbelievable. Unbelievable. I mean, the worst to me was when a little girl was playing with her Muslim friend, 3 years old. And they say, at our house we say, Hail Mary, full of grace. ISIS took her and crucified her and stabbed her with a knife. That is demonic evil, to do such a thing to a 3-year-old girl. Unbelievable. And this is something that is destroying Muslim culture worse than it normally. The Muslim culture has been on a downward slide since the 11th century. But this is just totally undoing them. As I said in the last group, can any of you think of the last Muslim invention you ever used? What's the last Muslim invention you ever used? Because you use it every day. Pardon? Algebra. Prior to algebra, something else that they invented. The numbers were from India. Arabic numerals are actually Indian numerals. They didn't invent those. No, some Ethiopian guy was a Christian, actually. The decimal point. No, chess is from India. The decimal point is the last Muslim invention that made algebra possible. And so then algebra is a Muslim invention, and the decimal point. They use the decimal point every day. I mean, they can't change. The one before that was smallpox inoculation. They came up with that in the 11th century. It worked so-so. It wasn't great because they didn't have it refined, but they did come up with smallpox. It's remarkable, wonderful. But it was so-so because sometimes you got smallpox and died from the inoculation because they didn't know how to do dosages. But they did come up with it. Other than that, nothing. None of these terrorists use the al-Husseini rifle. They use Kalashnikovs. And if they can get our stuff, but they invent nothing. And that decline is just being hastened by this violence. And one of the goals we have to have is, and I'm totally again, Mr. Bush was absolutely incorrect in trying to impose democracy in Afghanistan or Iraq. Muslims cannot deal with democratic forms of government. It's not in their mentality at all. You have to let them have their own form of government, but make sure that whatever government there is has its limits to protect them from doing the kind of violence that's been going on. But you can't impose democracy. That's absurd. It's absurd. It was a fool's errand. And the present president and his administration have proven themselves completely incompetent. They've chosen the wrong sides all over the place, and they've brought on more chaos. It's unbelievable, the chaos and tension that's going on now. It's the worst it's been since the First World War. So we'll have to see. Now, I'm going to open it for your questions and comments about that or some other topics if you have them. Yes, sir. They want you to stand up and speak loudly. No, you can face me.
Okay. Do you think that it really is not as much of world leaders that have been causing the chaos, but instead an inherent attitude amongst Islamic people that everyone has to follow their own?
An interesting option. That is it something inherent in Islam, or are world leaders causing it? I don't think. My answer would be C, both of the above. For instance, at the end of World War I, the French and the British made the Sykes-Picot Agreement where they were dividing up the Middle East. That wasn't theirs to divide up. And of course, what was at stake? They wanted oil. Now, they didn't know how much oil there was, but they knew there was oil in Iraq and in Iran. It was only in the 1930s, they found out there was oil in America, and by that point, the Ibn Saud, the king of Arabia, didn't like the British at all, so he went to the Americans, and Roosevelt and he met, and we got oil with them. But our interest has been in exploiting their resources and not really helping out a whole lot, except as it helps our economy. That's not right either. So you've got, and also, I almost forgot, after World War II, the Soviet Union and NATO were fighting proxy battles in the Middle East, as they did elsewhere too. And that wasn't right. There was nothing good about that. They're not our puppets and tools. So you had bad actions by both the Soviets and the NATO powers. Arming these folks. You probably heard of the Six-Day War in Israel in 1967. That was instigated by the Soviet Union. They said to the Arabs, hey, did you know our satellites are showing that the Jews are lining up on the border? What are you going to do about it? And so they said, we better go. So they lined up. The Israelis said, we're not at the border. We're not there. All the Russians said you are. So then the Israelis came up to the border. And then you had these two groups, and the Soviets were playing this game to see how their weapons would work against American weapons. It didn't work well at all. It's cheap communist junk, as my cousins used to say. When I went to Poland and everything, they said, communist junk, no good. And so it was a catastrophe. And, because the Western powers are playing games. But that was it with the nationalists, because the Israelis also, Zionists are a nationalistic movement. 80% of Israelis don't believe in God. They're atheists. They're not fighting over religion. It's over national identity. And so it's very nationalist, and they played right into it. And now you see that the reaction against that nationalistic involvement and nationalistic governments and oppression is from inside Islamic mentality. And there are Muslims using the interior Muslim thought to bring on this chaos. And I think it's even worse. The Shah of Iran was a horrible, oppressive man, and his government was horrendous. His secret police were vicious. But when the Islamists took over Iran, they only increased the oppression. And it became far worse. More kidnappings by the police and imprisonments and torture than under the Shah. And that's the problem. That's the problem right there. Sir.
Just to sort of clarify, when you go off on talking about how nationalist, that sort of movement creates a lot of this sort of oppression, would you not agree with the statement that that also stems from a sort of a religious identity, such as in Syria with the Alawites and with the Sunni Shia sort of identity between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
Okay, so when I talk about the nationalism being there, does that not come from the Alawi? And so folks understand, the Alawi are a sect of Islam that broke off from the Shia. Okay, so it's named after Ali, who's the founder of Shia Islam. And does not. So your question is not that religious element part of it? No. As a matter of fact, until recently, Syria was the best place to belong to a religious minority. They did not, it was absolutely forbidden to mess with any religious minority in Syria. And so some of the smallest and very old sects of Christians were fine. If you asked any of the Christians, Syria was a great place to be. Jordan was second best, because they're also they respect the Christians, they leave them alone. It's only that for al-Assad, he wasn't trying to push Alawi doctrine at all. It had nothing to do with it. He did not want to lose control when there were people in his country going against his oppressive approach, because they were squelching a lot of economic development in order to keep a tight lid on things. And in the face of an opposition, which was not tolerated under any nationalist government, nationalists and dictators don't tolerate opposition. And so at that point, they began to kill them, and it erupted into the civil war. The Alawi relationship allows them to have a better relationship with Hezbollah, a Shia group in southern Lebanon, and with Iran. They're amicable, and they feel like compadres ideologically, but it's not to promote Alawi or Shia theology at all.
I would say it's more central because it does seem in Syria before escalation came off that it was under al-Assad's government that Alawites came and they were getting easier jobs and they were higher employment. In these minorities,
Well, sure.
our struggle not come from like religious identity and then win the battle to see the Kurds.
Yeah, see, in some ways, in some ways, mostly no. With the Alawi. Have you studied much about the Alawi? a little, because one of the things about Alawi Islam is you are not permitted to know the doctrines of the Alawi sect until you're 50. Because it's a secret. They don't know their doctrine. It just becomes, it's more like a Masonic lodge of Islam. And like other Masons would hang out with other Masons and give them jobs, that's more the issue. The core was the military leadership in Syria, happened to be Alawi under Hafiz al-Assad, the father.